Imagine you're in a music class. I pass out sheet music. I teach you about notes, octaves, and instruments, pitch and tone. We discuss time signatures and repeating codas, sonatas and rap. All semester, I tell you, music is amazing. I proclaim certain melodies bring people to tears. I tell you how much I love music. But I never play you a single song. I only let you write and read music on a page. I never let you strum a guitar or beat a drum. We never sing. I never offer you the experience of music. And then I wonder, why don't you like music, I say? Why don't you get it? You look frustrated. This brings me to poetry. Last year, poet Ben Lerner published a book titled The Hatred of Poetry. Clearly, poetry has problems. Lerner explains one. Many more people agree they hate poetry than can agree what poetry is. What is poetry? Is it that hard to define or enjoy? Is it like music? Is the experience essential to its understanding? There are foundational poetic experiences, yes, experiences you did not receive in school, because these poetic glimmers are not testable, and therefore you were not taught them. I know this because I taught boring, confusing, bad poetry lessons and watched as they failed the wisdom of our greatest poets. Welcome to the University of Denver, fall of 2015. I thought I had made it. I survived a summer of 10-hour study days, passed my comprehensive exams. I was finally finished with my own coursework, and for the first time in nearly a decade of graduate study, I was going to teach an elective course. For once, my students chose to study the art of poetry. They were going to like poems. And I had built a syllabus of life-changing poems. That afternoon, when I walked into the classroom, I truly believed I had a gift to give. That semester, I would change my students' lives. But here's what changed mine. They didn't care. They didn't want my gift. And although they had elected to take my course, they actually wanted to watch House of Cards with one earbud in, flirt, eat burritos, browse Facebook, whisper, sleep. And 8 weeks later, once again, I had become a poetry witch, leading a silent and miserable classroom. But this semester was extra bad. No one did the reading, and I felt forced to give a pop quiz at the start of every class. Then I would grade those quizzes on the spot and kick everyone out of class except 2 studious English nerds. Each night on the drive home, I would cry. Then I would lie on my apartment floor and eat chips and cry. I Googled new career options. I took online strength finder tests. What's a few more years of school? I felt jealous of my sister who was becoming a lawyer. I wondered if I even liked poetry. I wondered why I had made such a terrible life mistake, becoming a poet. Why didn't my parents stop me? Why did I get the lucky elective class containing 11 fraternity bros? Why? This fall was supposed to be different. Looking back on it, I can see that my life breakdown wasn't about some students who didn't do their reading, but they were mirroring back to me what it really was. Through the course of my education, I had begun to believe poetry was valueless. This was pretty terrifying. I had spent my entire professional development on the study of poems. Poetry was my identity, income, well-being. And honestly, this was something I was insecure about. Did I have any real value? When I would sit next to a stranger on a plane or converse with someone standing in a line, the moment I told them I was getting a PhD in poetry, they would all get a weird face and say the exact same thing. What are you going to do with that? Teach? When was the last time you purchased a book of contemporary poetry? Yeah, I was going to teach. But at that moment, I hated teaching. And the harder I tried to excite or explain poetry to my students, the more blank stares I met. If you think taking a poetry class is bad, try leading one. Why couldn't I convey everything I understood and loved? Why was I failing miserably? That leads me to this moment, standing in front of you, wanting to tell you what feels like a lost secret, a hidden gem, something the poets know, keep to themselves, and use in their lives. But that's something school silences. Poet Robin Blazer of the San Francisco Renaissance explains the problem. We wind up at the University of California. You can't use the word spirit, soul, any of those things, because they belong to a non-rationalist view. Now, it's very hard to understand what that means, except you weren't supposed to use them. Contemporary poet Nathaniel Mackey explains today's problem like this. We live at a time in history here in the United States in which nothing exists unless you can see it, touch it, smell it, or hold it in your hands. Soul doesn't exist in that mentality. In an interview, Mackey explains the necessity of continuing to pursue soul, despite the term being bracketed, and even out of fashion in poetry quarters where that term has traditionally been at home. Mackey's work is brave and vital for poetry. In school, we teach poetry as a literary art, but that is only one half, if not a smaller fraction, of poetic experience. Poetry existed long before there was any such thing as literature. Poetry is first and foremost a spiritual art form. I speak for myself when I say, for fear of looking naive, not rational, not academic, I talked around the vital half, the half that is the experience, the knowing, the silent sound behind the words. But doing so, I was teaching the terrible music class I described earlier. I was missing the most important aspect. Poet Barbara Guest of the New York School of Poets explains that aspect. The most important act of a poem is to reach further than the page, so that we are aware of another aspect of the art. This will introduce us to the spiritual essence. The essence has no limits. But Guest was concerned that in the institution there was what she called a demise of the spirit. And during her life, she worried poetry, and therefore the meanings we make in our lives would start to reflect that spiritual absence. Her concern has come true. In the majority of classrooms across America, like in mine, that absence is a reality, and the reasons feel complex. Historically, poets were messengers of the gods. Today, we are careful to separate church and state in public school. But let me be clear, poetry is not any type of religion. It's completely free of doctrine and dogma. Every religion, race, sexual orientation, gender has a poet. Still, it is a human experience that involves a spiritual realization, a sacred epiphany, to use the term of the ancient Greeks. Furthermore, an instructor really shouldn't give away their beliefs. Science can't prove a spiritual dimension. Academics can't even agree what poetry is. This silent absence, that bracket, it's very present, and yet it's missing. I believe the missing element in the poetry classroom is the missing experience in our daily lives, when we have meaning, but we don't have meaningfulness. We have words on a page, but we don't feel poetry. It's the fullness of meaning that we all crave, the experience of our fullness. That's what a poetic experience offers to each of you. But if we're missing the foundational teaching of poetry, the personal experience of our spiritual essence, then we're missing the poetic dimension in our lives. And that's sad, because poetry's dimension is life itself. To have life, to be alive, to be filled with spirit, to live on a planet with others and oceans and flowers, to see that beauty as your own. That fullness cannot be put into words. It is, as Guest said, beyond the page. It has nothing to do with rhymes, metaphors, or memorization. It won't help if I ask you to count iambic pentameters in sonnets or the syllables in haiku. No amount of literary analysis will tell me your soul's experience when you bite into a summer's peach. No paper you write will reveal the vitality of your being when you dive in the sea, and no literary term will explain the feeling of holding a newborn baby, watching the totality moment of an eclipse, seeing your partner smile, or being in the room when someone you love takes a final breath. It won't work if I tell you the poem has one correct meaning, that these experiences have one correct fullness, that there's something to get that you don't already have. So if your poetry class left you feeling like poetry is useless, I want to offer you a way to create poetic value in your own life so you can experience poetry's rapture for yourself. One night, during the poetic crisis of my life, I realized I had ironically forgotten the one thing poetry teaches better than any other subject: how to make meaning. Not just flat, arbitrary meaning, but soul-fulfilling meaning. Then it occurred to me, if I just started living and teaching the exact same way I write or read a poem, maybe I could find what I was missing. The question became, how could I reverse engineer poetic experience, the unspeakable experience of poetry, for myself, for my students, so we could all feel it individually, create it in our days, and let its presence help us live our lives, as Wallace Stevens famously wrote. This question took me off the page, back to a very ancient poetry, where to be inspired, inspirare, meant to breathe or blow into, to be filled with spirit, the breath of life. And poetry, poesis, meant only to make or making. And Plato argued, anyone who made something from nothing was a poet. That's the poetry I now teach to CEOs and other innovators, a spiritually liberated poetry, a life-liberated poetry, the poetic art of how to be inspired, how to be filled with life, and then make something meaningful from nothing. Now, poets, although they work in the line of sages, prophets, and mystics, they're just ordinary people, maybe a little out there, but they are living in a world full of joy and making deep meaning every day as they witness spiritual essence in everything. William Carlos Williams has a poem where he sees divinity in a man gathering dog poo. The old man who goes about gathering dog lime walks in the gutter without looking up, and his tread is more majestic than that of the Episcopal minister approaching the pulpit of a Sunday. These things astonish me beyond words. That same astonishment lives inside you. You all have your own criterion for truth and beauty. You all have the ability, when you get quiet, to render yourself speechless. You can create your own inspiration and bring yourself to a place beyond language. That's what I love most about poetry. Most of us live our lives thinking inspiration is something we have to wait around for. We're waiting for the idea to strike, for the moment we can be creative. And yes, inspiration does strike, but a poet also knows they can make their own inspiration. They can fill themselves with the breath of life. All they have to do is start making it, bringing attention to their existence, to the magnificence of being alive, and in rapture of that. That is the first meaning the poet makes. And when we start making meaning there, with that incredible, but simple, but incredible awareness, anything we add is only going to blow us open with beauty and wonder. As your poetry teacher, I have to teach you first how to be alive. I have to let you feel the enormousness of living. I have to offer you space to create your own inspiration, to fill your own spiritual essence. You must experience that beyond word swell of connection and power to your life first, before I can teach you to make anything with it. But if you are alive, you have already started making poetry. And the person who enters completely into the experience of poesis, of making, will be initiated into a deeper intimacy with life itself. So go, transcend, follow your impulses, make life, breathe life with the awareness and silent wonder of what Walt Whitman sang, that you are here, that life exists and identity, that the powerful play goes on, and you may contribute a verse. For when you live poetically, you are responsive to your deepest voice, the callings, truths, and truest expression, whether in words, whether in paint, whether in business, or in a garden of your being. I won't define it. What is poetry? It's limitless, but it is. And what's a song without the pulse behind it? It's your life without your soul behind it. It's the world without humanity's beauty and fullness behind it. We are all masters, all poets, all conductors. We only have to open up and discover what is already here. I will leave you with one final consideration. Dear beings, welcome to Earth. You have arrived. There will be raging rivers and stars, and you can travel to the south of France, climb the mist in Bhutan, and every single day, a sunset. And yeah, it will hurt, but there will be dazzling cities and wind. And somewhere in between, you will love and you will die. And that, all of it, is poetry. Those are the opening words to the poetry class you never took and I never taught. Thank you.